Hey everyone, welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on language acquisition. The article that we read for today was this article entitled A New View of Language Acquisition, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. First, let's go ahead and contextualize the discussion of this article, okay? Because one of the main points of this article is to advance the debate about language acquisition in a novel way, okay? So in order to move the debate of language acquisition forward in a novel way, we need to understand the historical context in which this debate is occurring. And as we've discussed in previous lectures, as we've reiterated throughout the course so far, there's two major views of language learning or language acquisition. We know that one of those views was proposed by B.F. Skinner, and that was a learning theory account of language acquisition. The learning theory account of language acquisition is the position that language acquisition is due to the monitoring and management of rewards and contingencies. Okay. The alternative view, right? So Skinner's view is the tabula rasa blank slate view, right? And the way that we learn language is through conditioning, rewards and punishments, steering us towards memorizing the correct words that we've been provided through experience. The other view of language acquisition or language learning was advanced by Noam Chomsky, and this is a nativist account, okay? It's one that posits a universal grammar or an innate cognitive module, okay? So the nativism, this view, this is the position that language acquisition is due to an innate language faculty. And we compare this to a heart or the lungs, something that we bring with us into the world, something that just requires some maturation, some natural development. It's not something that we learn or we gain from the outside world, right? My heart, it comes with me. And as long as nothing unfortunate happens in the environment through natural development, all humans will have a language faculty and their physiological faculties or modules as well, like the heart and the lungs, okay? So we're very clear on those two views, and we've seen in the article by Spelke that we can think of them as extremes, like dichotomous categorical extremes, like you're either a nativist or you're an empiricist, right? You're either Skinner or you're Chomsky, and that's the debate, right? What we've seen though, what we've seen through discussion of developmental results, especially in the last lecture with Berkeley, is that it may be more fruitful to think about a continuum, right, between strongly innate and strongly acquired from experience and development, and then we can sort of plot different forms of knowledge along that continuum, right? This is for useful for language, like the things that we learn linguistically, right? We learn how to form the plural of a word like wugs, right? We can take wug and form wugs earlier than we can apply a rule to derive an adjective, right? We saw that from Berkeley. Similarly, some aspects of object representation is available earlier and some is available later. And we saw that from the research by Spelke and other colleagues, right? So we see that having a continuum, a developmental timeline, can be helpful for us to plot all the amazing forms of knowledge that we have as humans, right? So we're gonna, before we look at the view advanced in this article, just a reminder also of the view of what a module is, right? Fodor put forward the idea that the mind consists of cognitive modules, and those modules have several properties. The three that we focused on in the course so far were domain specificity, right? That a module is specific for a certain domain. The heart is only for pumping blood through the body. and the language module is just for language processing, and the vision module is just for visual processing. Okay, this is also related to the next feature of cognitive modules, information encapsulation. So information processing from vision is distinct from information processing from olfaction, for example, right? And then modules are innate. They are part of our hardware as entities, the sort of natural beings that we are. Okay, and those are just sort of the properties of modules. If we are committed to the view that language acquisition is due to innate cognitive module, these are sort of the features that we assume that it has. Okay. All right. So one of the main points of this article is to think about an alternative view and consider some evidence that might exist for an alternative view. Okay. So on the one hand, the kind of learning taking place in early language acquisition cannot be accounted for by Skinnerian reinforcement. Okay. So something like we've seen throughout the course so far that something like a pure behaviorism, it doesn't have the explanatory power to account for a lot of the interesting linguistic properties that we understand and that we demonstrate. Okay. On the other hand, the idea that language acquisition involves a selectionist process where language input operates on innately specified options, that also seems like that's not supported. Okay. And recall that what we mean here, that was sort of a lot of words. What we mean here is that as children, remember, we're all born with the ability to potentially speak any language. And that's sort of one of the really cool things about us as children, is that when I pop out of the womb, I could be a native French speaker, I could be a native English speaker. I'm available to speak any of the world's languages. And that's really awesome, right? And then what happens from there, the idea is that we're born with this innate language ability. And then what experience does is sort of like turn our switches on or off. It sets our what are called parameters, right? So you can think of rules. I use the word rules because it's very easy for us to understand, but another word is principles, right? Rules are principles. So another way to characterize this idea is principles and parameters, right? We sort of have rules and then parameterizations that can be set, right? So for one principle, like word order, it can be switched one way or another depending on the language community that I'm in, right? So the idea here is, as children, we're born with this sort of like universal list of rules, right? Just imagine it's like 400 properties for UG. And then what experience does is, like, if I pop out in a English speaking community, well, then experience turns my switches such that I can master English and not be picking up on all the other alternative languages, right? So that's what's meant by a selectionist process, where I have it all in the beginning and then experience like turns some of the switches off or prunes them away. I think that's another helpful way to think about it, where you're sort of pruning away options, right, of what language you're tuning for. Okay. So we see here that both of these views are going to seem a little bit extreme, and we'll get a better intuition or feeling for that as we consider some of the evidence. Okay. All right, so one of the things that was discussed in the article that's interesting and relevant for us to discuss today is that initial perception parses speech correctly and is universal, but not domain specific or species specific. Okay, so what do we mean by that? Well, one of the really cool things about language, especially speech, right, is that I tend to talk very fast, and I have to purposely sort of slow down to give a lecture at the appropriate pace. But, if you just hear me talking and I'm excited about something, you notice that all my words start to flow together, right? And what's really amazing is that you don't hear this as just sort of like a flood of acoustic stimuli, right? You don't hear my speech the way that this looks at the top, right? At the top, I have right here, how do we individuate the continuous flow of speech into linguistic units, right? How do we parse this string into meaningful units, right? And that's a pretty amazing ability that we have, both auditorily as well as visually. Like signers can see this too. Any theory of language acquisition should be able to account for this and tell us how infants parse their auditory world into meaningful units. Infants demonstrate an amazing ability to parse speech correctly at the phonetic level, and they demonstrate this ability, again, for any of the world's languages. Worker and colleagues in 1984 demonstrated that infants can discriminate non-native phonetic contrasts at 6 months old, okay? And what that means is phonetic contrast is I can understand the distinctions, the sound distinctions of a non-native language, right? So if you're Japanese, the Japanese language doesn't make use of the RL distinction like we do in English, right? And also in English, there's certain distinctions that we don't use that other languages do use, right? It's sort of a thing for each language is we pay attention to certain sound contrasts and we make use of those in our language, whereas other languages focus on other sound contrasts, okay? So interestingly enough, right, when we're young, on 6 months and younger, we can pick up the phonetic contrasts of all the world's languages. Early views that tried to explain this, recall I mentioned, were selectionist in nature, right? They assumed that there was an innate neural specification of all possible phonetic units, right? Like meaningful sound units, like in English, a rake and lake, right? That's what's called a minimal pair. They're linguistic units that differ in only one sound unit, right? I just replaced the with the ul, right? And that makes that sound difference makes a meaningful difference between those two linguistic units, right? So that's what we call them a minimal pair. They differ in one unit, and what the point here is that the idea on the selectionist account is that we have some innate neural specifications that allow for all the possible phonetic units, okay? And then what happens is only a subset of those are activated and maintained through experience, right? You can think that I might have neural units for each phonetic possibility, but only the ones that are evidenced or presented in my native language are maintained or kept on through linguistic input, right? So for example, in English, we make use of and ul. And so since I get that as my linguistic input, then my innate neural units that are recruited for those phonetic possibilities are maintained, whereas perhaps there's phonetic units in other languages that I'm not exposed to in English, those units will go away, right? Sort of like a use it or lose it, right? If I'm not using it, if I'm not using my neural circuitry for sounds of other languages, then they'll in some sense just go away, right? They'll be selected away. That's sort of the selectionist view, okay? And some of the data that suggested that this might be a reasonable view of the selectionist view might be a reasonable view was, recall the work by Worker, right? Worker 1984 showed that 6 month olds can discriminate non-native phonetic contrasts, but at 12 months, they were no longer able to do so, right? So it tells you that something's going on from 6 months to 12 months, where earlier I can discriminate any sounds, like French, no problem, German, no problem, Japanese, no problem. Any sound contrast that they use, I can distinguish it. I can hear the difference between those sounds in those languages. However, by 12, right, in some sense, I can't do that anymore, right? Whatever's going on, whatever makes that discrimination possible, that is no longer available to me, right? One of the major questions is, how do we really explain that developmental process? Is it through just a pruning or a selection, or is it through something different, maybe like a perceptual learning or a warping? Okay, and that's going to be sort of the view pursued in this article. All right, and just to be clear about some terminology, this isn't a linguistics course, so we won't spend too much time talking about it, but it's helpful to just understand some of the terminology. So phonetics, that has to do with the study of all the possible speech sounds, right? So if I'm a phonetician for a living, then I may use equipment to study like the formants and the frequencies of all the possible speech sounds of all the languages, okay? So phonetics is the study of the speech sounds, and it looks like this. You know, we look at formant frequency configurations when we're doing phonetics. Phonology is slightly different, but very much related, and phonology just concerns the particular sounds that you use together in your language, right? So whereas phonetics is the study of like all the speech sounds, you can engage in phonology of English or of Spanish or of ASL. Even ASL has a phonology, which is very interesting. Okay, we can talk about that later. Okay, but just so we're clear on what the terms are and the distinction between phonetics and phonology. Okay, so this article suggests that language experience warps phonetic perception rather than selects from phonetic units. Okay, and all of that might seem similar, like what's the difference, right? It's actually a difference in that selection is like pruning away, right? And you might think that once you've pruned away certain possibilities, they're no longer available, right? Like you may not be able to recoup those possibilities once they're gone, right? Warping has to do more with like perceptual tuning, and that makes it more available for tuning back, right? You might lose an ability but gain it back, right? And those are sort of different predictions from these different views of language acquisition and language development, okay? So this, importantly, nativism isn't really committed to the view that once you lose something, you get it back. This view is more pursuing that idea, okay? So this view that language experience warps phonetic perception rather than selects from phonetic units, this offers an alternative to the extreme nativist view, right? Like the view that's on the far side of Spelke's continuum, okay? So one thing that we'll look at for this topic is the perception of the ul contrast that we use in American English by Japanese listeners, okay? So the ul distinction is difficult for Japanese speakers to perceive and produce, since this is not a meaningful distinction that they use in their language, right? Like, why would they track this distinction? It would be like me when I'm listening to English, tracking distinctions that are not in English, but like in a different language, right? Why would we do that? And it makes sense why we don't do that, because if you think of how many possible languages there are, if we had to track all the possible distinctions between all the possible languages, cognitively, that's too much work, right? It doesn't make sense why we would engage in so much labor, right? So I say that it's not a fault or a shortcoming that we become specialized for our language, right? This is actually a good thing, right? It helps us become specialists in our language, and then that lets us hear the proper sounds in our language among variable acoustic stimuli, right? We might be at a lecture hall where it's noisy. I live across the street and cars are always driving by. Even given a calm environment, the way that I pronounce words, like the way that I give a lecture and the way that you give my same lecture, the words are going to sound different, right? And so for us to understand categories, right, like that this is a k sound and this is an ul sound, then we need to not just track like specific waveforms, like we can't be tracking something like at this fine grain level, right? We need to be assimilating similar instances that are similar enough into a category, right? So you need to hear different, slightly different versions of k, right, as k, right? Like even now, there was a difference in k and k, but you hear it as belonging to the same category, right? And this is useful so that way when you give a talk about cats or dogs and I give a talk about cats and dogs, even though the waveforms are slightly different because we're of different size, age, and whatnot, we understand the words as being categorically the same. Okay. All right, let me get back to. Okay, so this is just to say that, of course, Japanese speakers are not going to track ul distinctions like we would in English, because this is not a meaningful linguistic unit in their native language. Okay. So, since Japanese does not distinguish between and ul, when Japanese speakers hear speech sounds that phonetically approximate and ul, they'll hear them as members of the same category, right? They're not distinguishing between and ul because that's not a meaningful distinction that they need for the words in their language. Whereas we do, right? In English, we use rake and lake to distinguish between those two words. So we track that distinction between and ul, whereas they don't, okay? So we can think of this as demonstrating a perceptual magnet effect where the phonetic categories of your native language will pull nearby instances towards those categories, right? Like in your mind, you have prototypes or exemplary instances of those phonetic categories, like best versions of those sounds, like ul, right? And those best versions from your native language pull other instances that may not be as perfect, right? So I might say cat, but then maybe, you know, I'm tired or I've been lecturing all day, so later the way I say cat is slightly different, right? Cat, right? Maybe I don't articulate it as well, but you will still pull that cat into the best version, okay? And so you see that the best version helps to bring non-perfect versions as members of the same category, okay? And in the figure, right, we see that Japanese speakers pulled more of the ra-la stimulus continuum upward to more commonly identify this as ra, right, than English speakers did, okay? And so let me just, I kind of hit that point really quick, so let me say that again a little bit more slowly, okay? So if we look in this figure over here, we see that from the study, there is a ra-la stimulus continuum, right? And you could create this using sort of like vocal morphing software, right? Like you can have a ra sound and a la sound, and then you can morph them such that like in the middle, it's intermediate between ra and la, right? So we have this stimulus continuum, and what we're going to do is we're going to play that continuum to both Japanese speakers and American English speakers, right? And what we want to do is as we feed them different instances, like instances that sound more like ra and instances that sound more like la, we want to see how frequently do they rate those different instances as all ra, right? If they rated all the instances as ra, then that shows you that they're not discriminating between ra and la, right? Whereas on the other hand, if one half of the continuum they rate as ra, and the other half of the continuum they rate as la, that shows you that they are distinguishing between instances of ra and la along this stimulus continuum. Okay, and so what we see here is that since Japanese, they don't distinguish between ra and la, you see that, and whereas American English speakers do distinguish those, we see that the distinction here is much more extreme for Americans compared to Japanese, right? And what you can think about here is that since American English speakers have perceptual magnets for ra and la, that helps the American English speaker pull other instances, nearby instances, into those extreme categories, okay, those paradigm prototype categories, okay? And you don't get that pulling effect for the Japanese because they don't have those two prototypes distinguishing between rakes and lakes or and all, okay? So one more time to be super clear, I want us to understand what's going on with this figure. It's because we have two magnets that it pulls the figure in this sort of way. And since there isn't two magnets in Japanese, the results aren't as extreme, okay? All right. Since American English speakers use this raw-la distinction and have exemplary members of each phonetic category, the first half of the raw-la stimulus continuum is pulled towards ra, right? Whereas the second half of that stimulus continuum is pulled away from ra or towards la, okay? The main point is that the best examples of linguistically meaningful sounds in our native language, right? The phonemes that we use in our native language, they serve as magnets to attract similar instances. This helps us pick out the sounds of our language, right? Of our native language from the environment that often provides variable acoustic stimuli. Okay. And notice here that this is a statistical sort of phenomena, not a purely discrete phenomena, right? Interestingly enough, Zhang and colleagues in 2000 conducted a study where they trained adult Japanese speakers on the ul-er contrast, okay? They tested Japanese speakers on this contrast both before and after a training procedure. The training procedure that they used in this study consisted of 12 sessions of approximately 1 hour, okay? And what they did in this training session is they had Japanese speakers just practice the distinction between R and L, okay? Results from this study showed that on average, training resulted in improvement of correct identification from 57 to 79%. Okay, and we see that here, right? This figure on top, we just discussed in the last slide. But what I want to show you here is that the difference between pre and post-test, right? Before training, you see that the pull in opposite directions is less extreme, right? But post-training, right? That's that pink a line right here, we have something that looks more similar to the American result, right? What we see here is that through training, through experience, right, through practice, that Japanese speakers were able to improve their ability to distinguish between and o, okay? And why this is important, like, why this is so interesting is because it offers some insight into the debate about whether we should accept a selectionist account of the loss of phonetic distinctions, or whether we should appeal to something more like a perceptual learning or a perceptual magnet type of account, okay? Like a warping account where the warping is, it's possible to warp back, right? And not just sort of go in one way, like you lose it and you're done, right? So it's interesting to see that perception can recoup some of those distinction abilities, okay? So this suggests a statistical approach to language learning rather than an all or nothing approach. The exemplary or prototype instances of phonemes in our native language influences our perception in a statistical rather than purely a discrete or selectionist way. So we can sort of see in this figure right here, this is just sort of a model where Here we're plotting like the different formats in physical space, but the way that we perceive that becomes augmented through experience, right? Like the formats 2 and 3 here, you see right here, we can see down here, this is format 2 and this is format 3, right? And you see format 3, format 2, we can use the different format frequencies, right? F2 and F3 to distinguish between E and ah, these vowel sounds, right? E and ah can be distinguished with these format frequency configurations, okay? And so we see up here that by having, we can augment format, we can use a computer program to just augment the format frequencies. And even though they're evenly spaced in terms of physical stimuli, our perception of that stimuli is augmented, right? It's warped, if you will, through perceptual learning or perceptual experiences, okay? And what that means is I have magnets on both ends, right? Where like the sound, right, is pulling similar sounds in that direction, and sounds are being pulled in that direction, okay? All right, cool. So one thing that we looked at was that perhaps language learning is more statistical rather than discrete or selectionist, okay? And that would just encourage us to revise our theoretical position, right? Chomsky, Skinner, somewhere in between, right? Just modify our position about language acquisition theoretically, okay? Here's another thing to consider, is that initial perception parses speech correctly and is universal, but is not domain specific or species specific. Okay, this is another challenge to extreme nativism. And recall that nativism is the view that our language ability or our linguistic abilities are something special to the human species, right? They're innate to the type of creatures that we are, right? Like flying and certain like echolocation abilities are innate to like other animals, like bats, for example. We don't have those, right? So similarly, by considering language as innate and unique to humans, it would suggest that other animals wouldn't have the same linguistic abilities we do, right? And we saw that that was an argument for nativism because it seems like other animals don't have syntax like we do, right? We can recursively iterate operations and have infinitely long sentences, and other animals can't do that, right? And so that makes us think that we're special and that perhaps our linguistic ability is unique to the humankind, right? Here we're going to see a challenge to that view, right? At least when it comes to the ability to parse speech sounds. And the challenge comes from the fact that some research on non-human animals suggests that they're able to parse stimuli in a very similar way, okay? So humans and animals identification functions for two series ranging from a voiced to a voiceless phonetic unit is shown here, okay? A voiced phonetic unit is one that makes your throat vibrate, right? So duh, right, g. When you make those sounds, you got a little bit of a vibration in your throat, whereas t and k, there is no vibration. So that's just the distinction between voiced and voiceless units, right? Or the distinction between d to t and g to k, okay? And here, what we see, the important thing here is that when you look at this figure with me over here, we see that the way that this looks for animals and humans is very similar. So we see that the animal is in the dashed line right here, and the human is right here, okay? And we see that the way that they perceive categorical distinctions in sounds is very similar to how we perceive categorical distinctions in sounds, okay? And I'm gonna play an example for you right now that helps us hear this distinction, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and take 1 second to move the video to this quick YouTube video. It's about 2 minutes, and it's great. It's a short video that shows us an example where we can hear, right, by varying voice onset time, right, we're gonna hear that at some point it changes from b to p, right? Similarly for d to t and k to g, right? It's gonna be voice onset time is gonna help us cross this categorical boundary. Okay, so stand by 1 second.
Categorical perception is the experience of perceiving phenomena that can be varied along a continuum as fixed tokens. Since the speech signal presents us with far more information than we need in order to recognize what is being said, the central idea is that the speech perception mechanism is especially sensitive to specific cues in the speech signal. These cues are not perceived along a continuum, but as fixed categories. Let us take voice onset time to illustrate this phenomenon. The voice onset time, or short VOT, is the point when vocal fold vibration starts relative to the release of a closure. It is crucial for us to discriminate between clusters such as ba and pa, where we know that a gradual delay of VOT does not lead to a differentiation between voiceless and voiced consonants. Let us illustrate this. Ba, 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 ba. As we heard, a VOT value of around 30 milliseconds serves as the key factor. In other words, if VOT is longer than 30 milliseconds, we hear ba. If VOT is shorter, the perceptual result is pa. Other perceptual categories relate to the origin of the second formant that allow us to distinguish between different places of articulation, or frequency patterns that help us to identify a larger number of speech sounds. Categorical perception is thus opposed to continuous perception, where sensory phenomena are not based on fixed tokens, but can be located on a smooth continuum.
All right, so that was a nice short little video on categorical perception. And the main point here is that it's pretty cool that you see, although we're provided with a continuum, we hear the change categorically, right? And the important point here is that animals and humans actually hear that distinction in a similar location, right? So that's really interesting. Okay, so what that tells us, the important reason why we're raising this point is that there may be something that's not part of our linguistic module, but more of our perceptual parsing, right? That is not unique to us, but that we share with other animals, okay? So monkey discrimination performance for pairs of stimuli drawn from a continuum of speech sounds ranging from b to d to g show that sensitivity increases near locations of humans' phonetic boundaries, right? So where we draw boundaries phonetically, monkeys are also discriminating along similar boundaries, which is very interesting, okay? So at least when it comes to the ability to discriminate phonetic boundaries, this does not seem to require an innate specialized module that is unique to humans, okay? So universal linguistic module, okay? At least, and the important thing here, I sort of want to flag this here, is that so far, the debate in this article has focused on speech sounds, right? It's focusing on the phonology and the phonetics of language. It may be that that aspect of language is it shares mechanisms with other animals, but that's something about our syntax or morphology, right? Another aspect of language may be unique to us, okay? So again, I just want us to always be aware to think in a nuanced way that, language isn't just one thing, right? Language, right? There's actually many aspects that make language possible. And we need to always ask what parts of our linguistic ability are due to what factors, okay? All right, cool. So another interesting point to consider here is that newborn infants show experience-based preferences also, which highlights the fact that experience can influence humans even before birth, right? So we often think of experience as something we acquire after birth, and everything that happens before birth is innate. But what's very interesting, especially with respect to acoustics and our auditory perception, is that we're able to pick up sounds and become statistically sensitive to sound patterns even before we're born, right? As we develop in the womb, we're able to hear, right, and pick up acoustic patterns. For example, at birth, infants show a preference for the language spoken by their mothers during pregnancy, as opposed to another language that their mother doesn't speak. So if you're developing within the womb of a French speaker, then when you're born, you're going to have a preference for French as opposed to other languages that your person did not speak, right? So that's pretty interesting. It just goes to show you that we pick up on patterns statistically very early, right? And this also somewhat blurs the line between, innate and experience-based. So let's summarize some of the main points of the article, look at a few figures, okay, and then we'll wrap it up for today. So main points from today: linguistic experience produces mental maps for speech that are different for speakers of different languages. According to the native language magnet model, an infant's mapping of ambient language warps the acoustic dimensions underlying speech and produces a language-specific filter through which language is perceived, right? I perceive language largely through an English filter, but those of you that speak another language natively, you might perceive language primarily through that filter, okay? Also from this article, we saw that categorization, statistical learning, and prototype effects are not unique to speech, so we may not need to posit a language module specific for these abilities. And let's just take a look at some figures, okay? So we already saw here that we can use this spectrographic display to distinguish between speech sounds, right? Like the E in heat and the ah in hot. We can use the spectrogram as well as vocal tract configuration, right? And it's really cool to see the articulators at work inside the mouth for producing vowels and consonants. This is another spectrographic display that shows the running of speech, right? And I just think that it's awesome to look at this and just realize that we interpret that flow of stimuli as intelligible speech and not just like a wave of stimuli. What's this figure show us? Well, this figure shows us infant vowels recorded as they imitate an adult, showing their developmental change between 12 and 20 weeks of age. Okay, so you can see here that we have in green, red, and blue the three different vowel sounds, right? The major vowels, the contrasting vowels. We have hot, ah as in hot, E as in heat, and U as in moon, okay? And the important thing to see here is that earlier on at 12 weeks, although we do have some segregation or some separation of those speech sounds, they're still somewhat jumbled, right? The separation is not yet as clear as it is over here at 20 weeks, right? Over at, when we move to 16, it looks like it's almost like growing apart into three distinct things, right? This one looks a little bit more cleanly distinct. And over here, it looks like we're almost there. If we maybe wait a couple more weeks, we might get some clean partitions between these categories, right? And so the important thing here is that we see this sort of like development of distinct categories based on the phonetic prototypes, okay? All right, and this, let's look at this figure and try to figure out what this shows us. This shows us formant frequencies for vowels produced by American and Russian mothers as they talk to their infants and to other adults, right? The talking to the infants is shown in solid symbols. So the ones that are in colors, this is the speech provided to the infant, and the one that's an open symbol right here, this is provided for the adults, okay? And what that means is that there's more accentuation. We almost like just how like we draw cartoons in an exaggerated way, right? To make everything salient for children to observe. In a similar way, when we engage in what's called infant-directed speech, or as sort of an older school way to refer to that was motherese, right? But nowadays we call it infant-directed speech. What we do is we purposely exaggerate the vocal qualities of our words, just like we exaggerate our physical gestures or the drawings in cartoons, right? This is to help young children pick up on distinctions between these categories, right? So you see like the green in English, one instance of green is way up here, and one instance of blue is way down here, and one instance of red is way over here. And you can see in those instances, we're trying to really distinguish between ah, e, and oo, right? And as we, pick up on these distinctions, right, and we get older, we can start just giving like more consistent dry versions of those, more stable versions, which look like more fine-tuned, points here in that space, okay? And we see that's not only the case for English, but we see this in Russian as well, okay? And some, even now, I still read some articles, right, that say, don't engage in infant-directed speech to your children, right? But usually those are not based on current linguistic research, right? So, always draw your thoughts about language training and education from linguistic research, right? And now we're just tying our understanding from psychology and linguistics. We're seeing how that's applicable to education, right? So we see that cognitive science is positioned in such an important space, because since we're engaged in interdisciplinary work, we have the appropriate eyes to see, right, these are results that can apply very well to education and whatnot. Okay, so those were the figures that I wanted us to review for today. For my students in this course, go ahead and read the last two slides, which can just also review additional fun facts about language acquisition that may be on the quiz. Okay, so here's one and here's another. Okay, but I'll just leave it for you to examine on your own. Okay, so thank you for your attention today. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture, and I look forward to seeing you next time for our next lecture.